There are places that seem stuck in time, not in a poetic way, but literally frozen, as if something has refused to leave that ground, something that still watches, whispers, and waits. The Alistair Farm, on the outskirts of Ridgway, Missouri, is one of those places. No one has lived there since 1883, but the locals still avoid the dirt road that cuts through the back of the property even during the day. They say the air there whispers. I went there. But this story begins long before my visit. It begins with the noise of a city, with the smell of coal and hypocrisy. It begins in 1877, with the sound of a heart breaking. Captain Elijah Alistair was not a man of half measures. The world for him was a canvas of absolutes, black and white, God and the devil, honor and disgrace. The Civil War had taken from him the ability to tolerate ambiguity. He had seen good men commit atrocities and had returned home convinced that the only safe fortress was a life of rigid discipline and unshakable faith. His house was his barracks, his family, his troop. His wife, Margaret, was, in many ways, his opposite. Where he was rigidity, she was fluidity. Where he found comfort in order, she withered in the absence of passion. The love between them, if it ever existed, had become a treaty of coexistence, a silent agreement of duties and appearances. Elijah provided and protected. Margaret managed the home and maintained the silence. This silence was broken by a young doctor named Samuel Blackwood. He didn't have Elijah's severity, nor the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had gentle hands, an easy smile, and he saw Margaret not as the captain's wife, but as the woman she was, or could have been. Their affair was not an explosion of carnal passion, but a slow drip of solace and intimacy. Quiet conversations, a lingering touch on the wrist during an examination, the sharing of a book of poetry. For Margaret, it was a sip of water after years of thirst. For Elijah's order, it was a poison. The discovery was banal, like most tragedies, a letter forgotten in a coat pocket. Samuel's words, poetic and tender, became a live coal in Elijah's hands. He did not scream. Men like Elijah don't need to scream. His anger was a glacial force. That night, the house, already silent, became a vacuum. Every object seemed to scream of betrayal. He confronted Margaret in their bedroom. She didn't deny it. There was nothing to deny. Faced with her husband's frozen fury, she shrank, her guilt making her small, fragile. He didn't throw her out. That would be too public, an admission of failure. The stain on his honor was something he needed to cleanse in private. The solution for him was biblical. It was an exodus, an exile into the wilderness to purge the sin. His chosen desert was an isolated farm in Missouri, bought for a bargain, a place forgotten by God and men where he could rebuild his family on the pillars of toil and isolation. Their daughter, 14-year-old Ruth, watched all of this from an impotent distance. She didn't understand the details, only felt the seismic shift in the home's atmosphere. She felt the cold emanating from her father, the smell of fear coming from her mother. Ruth was a girl of few words but great perception. She lived more in books than in the real world, a silent observer of others' lives. In the carriage that took them to Missouri, she did not cry. She just watched the city disappear, sitting between two strangers who were once her parents. Their arrival at the farm was on a late August afternoon. The heat was a physical presence, humid and heavy. The two-story house seemed smaller than Elijah remembered, a dark silhouette against an orange sky. The porch boards creaked like old bones, and all around them, stretching as far as the eye could see, was a sea of corn. The stalks were high, dried by the summer, and the wind passing through them didn't sound like a breeze. It sounded like a collective sigh. Elijah disembarked and began to give orders, the energy of his fury now channeled into work. Unload the wagons, check the well, inspect the barn. It was his way of fighting, of imposing order on the chaos. Margaret stepped down from the carriage as if treading on foreign soil. Her eyes scanned the vastness, the overwhelming loneliness of the place, and something in her face seemed to surrender. She seemed to understand that this place was not a new beginning. It was a sentence. Ruth stayed behind, near the carriage, her eyes fixed not on the house but on the cornfield. She tilted her head, as if listening to something beneath the sound of the wind, a sound that no one else seemed to hear. The first few days were a succession of exhausting labor and heavy silences. Meals were consumed without a single word exchanged. Elijah ate with the fury of a man fighting a battle. Margaret barely touched her food, and Ruth ate slowly, her eyes alternating between her father and mother. The house was the third silent participant at the table. It watched. Its walls creaked, its doors sometimes closed slowly with a draft that didn't exist. Small things, things that could be easily ignored. It was Ruth who gave voice to the inexplicable. A week after their arrival, Margaret was outside in the late afternoon, gathering the dry sheets from the clothesline. The sun was setting, painting the cornfield with long shadows. Ruth came out of the house and stood beside her mother. "They don't like you being here," she said, her voice perfectly calm. Margaret stopped, a white sheet in her hands. "Who, Ruth? There's no one here but us?" Ruth didn't look at her mother. Her eyes were fixed on the depths of the cornfield. "The people who whisper. They say you brought the sadness with you." Margaret's heart went cold. She dropped the sheet. "That's foolishness. It's the wind in the leaves. Now go inside. It's getting late." But Ruth didn't move. "It's not the wind. The wind doesn't know names." That night, the first summer storm hit the farm. The rain was a curtain of water. The thunder made the whole house tremble. In the middle of the night, a flash of lightning lit up Ruth's room and she sat up in bed. Through the window, she could see the rows of corn being lashed by the storm. But for a brief second, in the lightning's glow, she saw more. Dark figures standing between the stalks. Tall, motionless, indifferent to the storm's fury. They were just watching the house. The next morning, the world was washed and fresh. The sun was shining. The storm seemed like a bad dream. But when Elijah went to inspect the property, he found something strange. In the middle of the muddy field in front of the house, there were footprints, dozens of them, barefoot. They didn't come from the road, nor did they go anywhere. They just formed a semicircle in front of the house, as if a silent crowd had spent the night there, in vigil, under the storm. Elijah, a practical man, assumed they belonged to some group of natives or travelers. He cleared the footprints with a shovel, his face a mask of irritation. He forbade Ruth and Margaret from straying far from the house. The outside world, to him, was a source of contamination, but the contamination was already inside. Margaret began to deteriorate. Guilt was an acid corroding her from within. She saw herself in her husband's disapproving gaze, in her daughter's observant stillness, and she began to hear things too. The name Samuel, the doctor whispered when she was alone in the kitchen, a baby's cry coming from upstairs where there was no one. She cleaned the house compulsively, scrubbing the floors and walls as if she could scrub the stain from her soul. She was becoming a ghost in her own life. Elijah, on the other hand, found refuge in his faith. He saw the farm's strangeness, not as a haunting, but as a trial, a crucible sent by God to test his strength and purify his family. He began to read the Bible aloud every night, his voice echoing through the house, a challenge thrown against the shadows. He walked the property with a defiant righteousness, convinced that his faith was an impenetrable shield. Ruth was the only one who didn't try to fight or flee. She watched, and she listened. She began to spend more and more time alone, sitting on the porch with a notebook in her lap, writing. It wasn't a diary of her feelings. It was a log. 2 p.m. A whisper came from the well. It sounded like a woman calling for water. 9 p.m. Footsteps in the upstairs hallway. 3 to the left, 3 to the right. Stopped in front of my bedroom door. She was treating the supernatural with a scientific curiosity. And the voices, perhaps sensing they finally had an audience, began to focus on her. They were no longer just murmurs in the wind. Sometimes they were clear. They were the voices of men, women, children. They spoke of ancient things, of failed harvests, harsh winters, of fevers that took entire families. They were the memory of the land, and the land was unhappy. The turning point, the moment the seed of horror truly germinated, happened on an autumn evening. The family was at the table for dinner. The silence was, as always, the main guest. Elijah ate. Margaret pushed food around her plate. Ruth was quiet. Suddenly, Ruth put down her fork. She looked directly at her father, something she rarely did. "Father," she said, her voice clear and firm, "the man who stands in the corner of the room doesn't like it when you read the Bible so loudly." Elijah froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "There is no man in the corner of the room, Ruth. Stop this blasphemy." "He's there now," Ruth insisted, her gaze shifting to the dark corner behind Elijah. "He's very tall, and he's angry. He says this house doesn't belong to your God." Elijah turned sharply. There was nothing there, only shadows cast by the oil lamp. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly on the floor. His face was red with fury. He saw this as a direct challenge, an insubordination from his daughter, perhaps contaminated by her mother's moral weakness. "Enough," he thundered. "I don't want to hear another word about this. In this house, the only name to be spoken is the Lord's." He expected Ruth to shrink, to cry, but she didn't. She maintained her calm gaze. She turned to her mother, whose face was as white as wax, and with a voice that was little more than a whisper but which cut through the air like glass, Ruth spoke the words that would seal all their fates. "Don't worry, Mother. They aren't angry with Father. They know it's not his fault." She paused, her eyes meeting her mother's with a terrible intensity. "They know it was you who opened the door for them when you brought your broken heart to this place." The echo of Ruth's words hung over the dinner table long after Elijah's chair had been pushed back and his figure had disappeared up the stairs. "They know it was you who opened the door for them." It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the chilling neutrality of a judge reading a sentence. Margaret collapsed in on herself, her body shaking in a silent sob. The dinner was left untouched. The seed of horror, planted in the fertile soil of betrayal and wounded pride, had sprouted. That night, Elijah did not read the Bible. His fury gave way to a cold, creeping fear. His daughter's declaration, mixed with the strange occurrences, had opened a crack in his fortress of faith. What if it wasn't God testing him? What if it was the other, drawn by his wife's sin, now using his own daughter as a mouthpiece? The nature of Elijah's war changed. It was no longer a test of endurance but a battle for his family's soul. He began his rituals. The next morning, Ruth found crude crosses, made from corn cobs and twine, nailed to the frame of every door and window. Elijah began to patrol the property's perimeter at dusk, a shotgun in one hand, the family Bible in the other, his lips moving in a constant, feverish prayer. He was turning the farm into a spiritual battlefield, and himself into the lone soldier. Margaret, meanwhile, sank deeper into her private hell. The voices, once indistinct murmurs, began to torment her in a personal and cruel way. In the solitude of the kitchen, while washing dishes, she would hear Dr. Samuel's voice, not tender as she remembered, but accusatory. "You ran, Margaret. You left me." Other times, she would hear a baby crying, faint and distant, seeming to come from the walls, a lament for a family she felt she had killed. The smell of pipe tobacco, Samuel's favorite, would appear without warning in her room, making her gasp in panic. The haunting used her memories as a weapon, turning her sanctuary of guilt into a permanent tribunal. And Ruth, she kept writing. Her journal became her only confidant, the only place where the madness could be ordered. October 28, 1877. Father nailed crosses everywhere. I don't think the voices liked it. The wind grew stronger during the night, and I heard a sound like fingernails scratching the roof. In the morning, 3 crosses from my bedroom window were on the floor. The twine wasn't broken. It was untied, as if patient hands had undone it in the dark. November 15th, 1877. Mother doesn't speak to me anymore. She just cleans. She scrubs the floor until the wood is pale. Today, while she was in the kitchen, I was in my room and heard a man's voice call her. "Maggie," he said. Mother dropped a plate. The sound of the broken glass was the only sound in the house for almost an hour. I think the whispers know that hurting her is the fastest way to get everyone's attention. December 1st, 1877. Winter is coming. The snow has covered the cornfield and now the world outside is silent. But the silence has made the sounds inside the house louder. The footsteps upstairs are almost nightly. They are not Father's steps. They are lighter and shuffling, like someone who has trouble lifting their feet. Today I heard a new name. It was very clear. A woman whispering near my window. "Sarah," she said. "Where is my Sarah?" The name Sarah marked a change. Ruth began to realize she wasn't dealing with mindless echoes. There were personalities, stories. Her project shifted from mere recording to an investigation. She would spend hours staring out the window at the snowy field, trying to imagine who Sarah was. Who were the others? Her fear transformed into a dangerous empathy. She didn't see them as monsters but as trapped, misunderstood souls, and she was the only one who heard them. While Ruth deepened her silent communication, Elijah waged his noisy war. His health began to suffer. He lost weight. His skin grew pale and stretched over the bones of his face. His eyes, red from lack of sleep, burned with a fanatical light. He saw demons everywhere, in the way the wind whistled down the chimney and the silhouette of a leafless tree against the moon, in his wife's empty gaze. His battle focused on a point in the house that had been ignored until then, the attic. The door, sealed with barbed wire, was an anomaly his fevered mind could no longer tolerate. To him, it was the enemy's citadel, the entry point of evil. If he could purify that place, perhaps he could save his home. On a frigid January afternoon, he decided to act. Margaret was in one of her cleaning trances and Ruth was in her room writing. Elijah grabbed a pair of pliers from the barn and climbed the creaking stairs to the second-floor landing. The attic door was at the end, dark and foreboding. The air there was noticeably colder. He approached, pliers in hand. The barbed wire was rusted but strong. It had been wound with a desperate force. As he worked to cut it, he heard a sound from the other side of the door. A rhythmic, soft sound. A slow creaking. Creak, pause. Creak, pause. It was the unmistakable sound of a rocking chair. Elijah's blood ran cold. He stopped. His breath caught in his chest. The sound continued for a few more seconds and then stopped, as if its occupant knew it was being heard. Elijah's hesitation lasted only a moment. His faith, or what was left of it, screamed that this was a trick of the devil to frighten him. With a cry of mixed fury and prayer, he applied all his strength to the pliers. The wire snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the silent hallway. He unwound the rest of the wire and with a trembling hand pushed the door. It swung open with a long, sharp groan, releasing a gust of air that wasn't just cold. It was dead air, stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust, rotting wood, and something else, something like dry leaves and an ancient sorrow. The faint light from the hallway penetrated the attic's darkness. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, untouched for decades. The sound of shuffling footsteps that Ruth heard at night now made a terrible kind of sense. They were the steps of someone wandering through this sea of dust. And in the center of the room was the source of the sound he had heard. A dark wood rocking chair. It was empty, and inexplicably, and profoundly disturbing, it was turned away from the door, facing a dark, windowless corner. Elijah took a step inside, his boot leaving a sharp imprint in the dust. His mind struggled to process the scene. It wasn't just the chair, it was the marks on the floor. The dust was swept away in two perfect arcs by the chair's rockers, but the wood beneath was worn, sunken. They were the grooves of years, perhaps lifetimes, of someone sitting in that chair, in total darkness, rocking back and forth, facing nothing. It was then that he noticed something else. On the wall the chair faced, at the height of a seated person's eyes, were nail marks. Dozens of scratches, some shallow, others deep, as if the person sitting there had, in a fit of despair or madness, clawed at the wall before them, day after day, night after night. Elijah backed away slowly, his heart pounding against his ribs. He had come to confront evil, to cast it out. But upon opening that door, he had the terrible feeling that he hadn't cornered a demon. He had just released a memory of a loneliness so deep and a despair so absolute that it refused to die. He closed the door slowly, but he knew it was too late. Whatever lived in that attic now knew the door was open, and the entire house had just become its room. The attic door, now open, changed the ecology of the house. The haunting, once contained, now seemed to leak into the lower floors like dark, cold water seeping through the floorboards. The atmosphere became heavy, charged. The horror ceased to be suggestive and became physical. Plates left on the kitchen table were found impossibly stacked on the floor. Tools disappeared from the barn only to reappear arranged in strange patterns on the porch. The doors, which once closed with the delicacy of a draft, now slammed with explosive violence in the middle of the night, making Elijah himself jump from his makeshift bed downstairs. The house was having a slow seizure. The increasing activity and the rumors escaping the farm eventually reached the ears of Reverend Miller, a practical man of serene faith who pastored the congregation in the nearby town. Concerned by the Alistair's prolonged absence from services and the stories about the captain's reclusion and erratic behavior, he decided to pay a pastoral visit. The sight that greeted him at the Alistair Farm would be seared into his memory forever. Elijah answered the door, but he was a skeletal version of the man he had known. His beard was unshaven, his eyes burned in their dark sockets, and he clutched the Bible to his chest like a shield. He was hostile, almost unintelligible, speaking of a war against the principalities of the air. Inside, the Reverend glimpsed Margaret, cleaning a window with repetitive mechanical movements, her face an empty mask. And he saw Ruth, sitting in a corner, who offered him a brief, calm smile that chilled him more than her father's madness. Reverend Miller left the farm, certain that this family didn't need prayers, but a rescue. Intrigued and deeply disturbed, he went to the county archives. If the problem was the land, the house, he needed to know its history. He spent an entire afternoon poring over the old, dusty books until he found the record of the previous ownership, the Redfern family. The cause of death in 1849, fever. But the Reverend was a meticulous man. He knew official records didn't always tell the whole story. It was in his own church's archives that he found the truth. A letter, yellowed with time, from the previous Reverend to the bishop. In the letter, the old pastor described his anguish over the Redfern family. He described the sudden madness that befell them. He wrote of how they complained of voices coming from the cornfield, of how their daughter, Sarah, would spend hours talking to invisible friends. The letter culminated in a terrible confession. The fever had been a lie to spare the community the horror. In truth, Thomas Redfern, the father, in a fit of desperation to silence the whispers forever, had taken the lives of his wife, Eleanor, and his daughter, Sarah, before hanging himself in the barn. A chill went through Reverend Miller's soul. The pattern was repeating itself. The land wasn't just haunted. It was a predator that used the same trap over and over. While the Reverend was making his discovery, the trap at the Alistair Farm was closing on Margaret. The torment against her became unbearable. The voices now mimicked Ruth's, whispering accusations. "You left us here, Mother. You condemned me." Her reflection in the mirror would sometimes contort into that of an old woman with white hair and empty eyes, a glimpse of her own future. One night something inside Margaret broke, or perhaps it was fixed for a brief moment. In a rare instant of clarity, she understood that she was the nexus. Her guilt was the nourishment that sustained the house's power, and the only way to save her daughter was to remove herself from the equation. In the quiet that precedes the dawn, she acted. She dressed silently, not making a single sound that might wake Elijah or alert the house. She left no note. She just opened the back door and ran. She ran into the darkness, into the falling snow, her only thought to carry her pain far away, to die on any ground other than that cursed soil. Her absence was noticed hours later. Elijah, in a mix of fury and panic, organized a search. He and a few neighbors, including the now alarmed Reverend Miller, spent 3 days scouring the area. The fresh snow showed no tracks leading very far. It was as if Margaret had been swallowed by the white landscape. On the 4th day, she was found. A neighbor on horseback saw her first. Margaret was standing, motionless, in the middle of the now snow-covered cornfield. She was staring at the house. As they approached, the sight made them stop. Her shoes were clean, her clothes dry, and her long brown hair, which fell to her waist, was as white as the snow at her feet. Her eyes saw nothing. She was physically there, but her soul had been reaped. They brought her inside. She sat in the nearest chair, and there she remained, day after day, a white-haired statue, breathing, but empty. The cure from the attic, the promise of a vacuum, had found a new vessel. Seeing her mother in that state was the final catalyst for Ruth. Her empathy for the spirits turned into a grim determination. She consulted her journal, the pages now filled with disconnected phrases and names. Sarah, Thomas, Eleanor. She believed she understood what they wanted. It wasn't malice. It was loneliness. They were silenced voices that needed a new host to tell their story. Her father tried to expel them with fury. Her mother had been consumed by guilt. Only she, Ruth, had listened to them with patience. In her 14-year-old mind, isolated and steeped in the supernatural, the solution seemed logical, even noble. She would do what no one else would. She would accept. She would become their voice. One afternoon, as the sky turned a sickly winter purple, she made her decision. Elijah was in his room, sunk in an exhausted, feverish sleep. Margaret was in her chair, motionless as ever. Ruth put on her warmest coat. She took her journal. She gave one last look at her mother's waxen figure and whispered, "I'm going to fix this." She went out into the biting cold and walked with steady steps toward the barn, the place where Thomas Redfern had ended his story, the place the whispers had told her was the heart of the farm. She opened the heavy wooden door and went inside. The darkness within was almost total. She closed the door behind her, plunging the world into silence. Or what, to her, felt like silence. Because as soon as the door closed, the whispers began, coming from every corner of the barn, eager, welcoming, and Ruth sat in her usual spot, opened the journal to the last blank page, and prepared to listen until the end. The next morning, Ruth's absence was a scream in the silence of the house. Elijah awoke from his stupor, and a paternal fear, long buried beneath fanaticism, surfaced. He searched the house, his heart sinking with each empty room. Finally, his attention turned to the barn. The door was closed. He shoved it open violently. The pale light of the winter morning streamed in, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. There was no sign of Ruth. The barn was empty. Almost. On a bale of hay, in the corner where Ruth used to sit, was her journal, open. Elijah approached, his hands trembling. He read the last entry, his daughter's handwriting clear and determined. "They are not evil. They are just lonely." Father yelled. Mother cried. No one listened to them. Sarah couldn't finish telling her story. "They need a voice. I will be that voice. I will sit in their heart and listen to everything until there is nothing left to say. They promised that after that, there will be peace. They only stop when someone listens to the very end." As the words bored into Elijah's brain, his eyes were drawn to the dirt floor beside the hay bale. Where his daughter had last sat, something was growing. From the frozen, sterile ground, a single plant was sprouting. It was an unholy thing. Its leaves were a green so dark they looked black, their edges serrated like teeth. At its center, a pale, almost gray flower was slowly blooming, releasing a cloyingly sweet odor of damp earth and decay. The sight of that plant, of that harvest, and the reading of his daughter's last words, was the blow that shattered Elijah Alistair's mind. His faith, his pride, his identity, it all dissolved. It wasn't God. It wasn't the devil. It was something older, hungrier, a sorrow in the land itself that had devoured his family, and he in his arrogance had fed it with his fury. He dropped the journal and staggered out of the barn, leaving the door open. His mind was now a chorus of screams. He no longer saw the snow or the fields. He saw the faces of everyone, of Margaret, of Ruth, of Sarah, of the tall man in the corner of the room. A week later, the people of Ridgeway found him on the main road, a naked, filthy specter, screaming at the empty sky. His war was over. He was now a monument to his defeat. The words he repeated were not for the living, but for the ghosts only he could see. "She opened the door, she opened the door, and now they know my name." To whom was he referring? To Margaret, who with her sin brought the first crack, or to Ruth, who with her empathy opened the final door? Perhaps it didn't matter. The house had taken them all. Elijah died 3 days later in a church room, his heart simply giving up. The farm was abandoned. Margaret was sent to a state asylum where she lived for another 20 years in her chair, with her white hair, never uttering another sound. The story became a local legend, a tale to frighten children. But places don't forget. The pain seeps into the wood, the stone, the very earth. I was there. I stood where the barn once was and looked at the foundation of the house. The air is still heavy. The silence still seems to be listening. The story of the Alistairs isn't just about ghosts. It's about how pride, guilt, and loneliness can dig a grave so deep that not even death can fill it. If you made it this far, take a deep breath. That was disturbing. But there are more cases like this out there. If you want, I can tell them. Just do not read this out loud, especially if you're alone. And if you hear something now, please, don't answer. Comment below what you would do if you were in the Alistair family's shoes. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share with anyone who enjoys strange stories like this one.